Welcome back. Today, we're talking about a word that sounds simple, but carries a lot of emotional weight: detachment. It's a word many people use, but very few truly understand.
And maybe that's because detachment isn't something you learn from definitions. It's something you slowly arrive at, often after experience teaches you what closeness has cost you.
When people hear the word detachment, they often imagine something harsh. They think it means becoming cold, distant, or emotionally unavailable, as if detaching from someone or something means you stopped caring altogether. The word carries a sense of withdrawal, like stepping back out of indifference or superiority. But that interpretation misses the truth. Detachment doesn't begin from a lack of feeling. It usually begins because there are too many feelings, too much emotional weight being carried for too long without relief.
Exactly. Detachment is rarely a sudden decision. It's not someone waking up one day and choosing to care less. More often, it's something that develops quietly, almost unconsciously, when staying emotionally connected starts to feel unsafe or overwhelming. It's a response to exhaustion, to disappointment, to the repeated experience of giving more than you receive. And that's why detachment is so misunderstood, because from the outside it looks like distance, but from the inside it feels like survival.
Another reason detachment is misunderstood is because people confuse it with rejection. They assume that if someone detaches, it means they've judged, dismissed, or devalued the other person. But detachment isn't about pushing someone away. It's about pulling yourself back. It's the moment you realize that constantly explaining yourself, justifying your feelings, or absorbing emotional chaos is slowly erasing your sense of self.
And that's where detachment becomes less about others and more about identity. When you stay emotionally over-attached for too long, you start to lose clarity about where you end and where others begin. Your moods depend on their behavior. Your peace depends on their approval. Detachment, in this sense, is not emotional numbness. It's the act of reclaiming your internal boundaries after they've been crossed too many times.
Most people don't detach because they want to. They detach because staying emotionally open starts to feel like a constant wound. At first, they try to communicate. They try to be patient. They try to understand, forgive, and adapt. But when those efforts are met with dismissal, inconsistency, or emotional neglect, something inside them begins to shut down, not dramatically, but gradually. Detachment begins as a form of emotional self-protection, not as punishment toward others.
There's also a quiet accumulation that leads to detachment. It's not one big betrayal or one major conflict. It's the small moments: feeling unheard, feeling taken for granted, feeling like your emotional presence is expected but never reciprocated. Over time, the mind starts learning that emotional closeness equals emotional cost. And once that connection is formed, detachment becomes a way to reduce pain, even if it also reduces intimacy.
Another reason people detach is because they've learned that caring deeply doesn't always lead to safety. For many, emotional attachment has been associated with instability, unpredictable reactions, emotional manipulation, or constant pressure to adjust themselves to keep the peace. Detachment then becomes a strategy to regain control. By caring less, or at least appearing to, they create emotional distance that feels safer than vulnerability.
And sometimes detachment happens not because someone else is doing something wrong, but because the person detaching has reached their emotional limit. You can only stretch empathy so far. You can only carry emotional responsibility for so many people before something gives. Detachment in this sense isn't a failure of love or care. It's a signal that the emotional system is overloaded and needs relief.
Most people don't detach because they want to. Detachment is rarely a deliberate or planned decision. It is something that grows quietly when staying emotionally open begins to feel like living with a wound that never fully heals. In the beginning, people usually do everything they believe is right. They communicate their feelings, explain their needs, and give the benefit of the doubt. They try patience, hoping that time will bring understanding. They try forgiveness, believing that empathy will fix what feels broken. They adapt themselves again and again, adjusting expectations, lowering standards, and convincing themselves that love or connection requires endurance. But when these efforts are met repeatedly with dismissal, inconsistency, or emotional neglect, something subtle begins to change. It is not a dramatic shutdown or a sudden loss of care. Instead, it is a slow retreat inward. The mind learns that vulnerability does not lead to safety, and the body learns to brace itself before emotions are even expressed. Each ignored feeling, each unmet need, each moment of emotional absence adds another layer of quiet withdrawal. Over time, openness starts to feel risky, even foolish, and emotional exposure begins to resemble self-harm rather than connection. Detachment, then, does not arise from cruelty or indifference. It arises from exhaustion. It is the psyche's attempt to protect itself when empathy has been stretched beyond its limits. By pulling back emotionally, a person is not trying to punish others or prove a point. They are trying to stop the internal bleeding that comes from caring without being cared for in return. Detachment becomes a boundary where words failed, a shield where understanding was one-sided. In this way, detachment is not the absence of feeling, but the consequence of feeling too much for too long without support. It is a survival response, a quiet recalibration of emotional investment. People detach not because they stop valuing connection, but because they finally recognize that staying fully open in an unresponsive environment costs them their peace, their clarity, and eventually, their sense of self.
There's also a quiet accumulation that leads to detachment, and this part is often the hardest to explain because nothing obvious seems wrong on the surface. It isn't one dramatic betrayal or a single moment that changes everything. It's the repetition of small, almost invisible experiences that slowly reshape how a person relates to others. Moments of speaking and not being truly heard. Moments of giving attention, care, or emotional energy without receiving the same in return. Moments where your presence feels expected, even relied upon, but your inner world remains unseen and unacknowledged. At first, these moments feel minor, easy to dismiss. People tell themselves they're overthinking, being too sensitive, or asking for too much. They minimize their own disappointment and keep showing up emotionally, hoping things will balance out over time. But the body remembers what the mind tries to ignore. Each small dismissal adds weight. Each unreciprocated effort leaves a trace. Slowly, the emotional system starts to recognize a pattern. Closeness requires effort, but that effort is rarely met with equal care. Over time, the mind begins forming an association between emotional closeness and emotional cost. Connection no longer feels nourishing, it feels draining. Intimacy becomes something that demands constant emotional labor, vigilance, and self-sacrifice. Without any conscious decision, the person starts to pull back just a little, sharing less, expecting less, caring more quietly. This withdrawal isn't cold or intentional, it's adaptive. It's the nervous system trying to reduce exposure to disappointment. Eventually, detachment becomes a strategy for survival. It lowers the emotional stakes, reduces the frequency of hurt, and creates a sense of control where vulnerability once felt unsafe. But this protection comes with a trade-off. While detachment reduces pain, it also reduces intimacy. The depth that once allowed for connection is replaced with distance, and the warmth of closeness is replaced with emotional neutrality. Detachment, then, is not a lack of desire for connection. It's what happens when connection repeatedly teaches someone that caring costs more than it gives.
Another reason people detach is because they've learned, often through repeated experience, that caring deeply does not always lead to safety. For many individuals, emotional attachment has been paired with instability rather than security. Love and closeness may have come with unpredictable reactions, sudden mood shifts, emotional manipulation, or an unspoken expectation to constantly adjust themselves to avoid conflict. Over time, the nervous system stops interpreting attachment as something comforting and begins to see it as something risky. In these environments, being emotionally open requires constant monitoring. You learn to read the room, manage other people's emotions, and suppress your own needs to keep the peace. Care becomes conditional, something you offer carefully, cautiously, never fully. Eventually, the emotional system reaches a limit. The cost of staying emotionally engaged becomes too high, and the mind looks for ways to regain balance and control. Detachment then emerges not as indifference, but as a coping strategy. By caring less, or at least appearing to care less, people create emotional distance that reduces unpredictability. Distance brings a sense of stability. When expectations are lowered and emotional investment is limited, there is less to lose. Vulnerability no longer feels like exposure, it feels optional. This form of detachment is often misunderstood as coldness or lack of empathy, but in reality, it is self-preservation. It allows individuals to function in relationships without constantly feeling overwhelmed, anxious, or emotionally unsafe. Detachment gives them a sense of autonomy over their inner world when past experiences taught them that emotional closeness meant surrendering control. In this way, detachment is not about rejecting connection. It's about protecting oneself when connection has repeatedly felt unpredictable and unsafe.
And sometimes detachment happens not because someone else is doing something wrong, but because the person detaching has simply reached their emotional limit. There is a point at which even the most patient, compassionate, and emotionally generous person runs out of capacity. You can only stretch empathy so far. You can only listen, support, absorb, and understand for so long without receiving care in return before the system becomes exhausted. This kind of detachment doesn't come from resentment or anger. It comes from depletion. Many people don't realize they are overloaded until their emotions begin to shut down. They may still show up physically, still speak kindly, still fulfill responsibilities, but internally there is a numbness forming. Emotional responsiveness decreases, not because they don't care, but because caring has become too heavy to sustain. The mind and body recognize that continuing at the same level would lead to burnout, emotional collapse, or loss of self. In this sense, detachment is not a rejection of love or connection. It is a protective signal. It's the emotional system saying, I need rest, I need space, or I can't carry this alone anymore. Rather than being a moral failure, detachment becomes a form of self-regulation. It allows the person to regain balance, reduce emotional pressure, and preserve what remains of their inner stability. Understanding detachment this way shifts the narrative. Instead of asking, why did they stop caring? The more accurate question becomes, how long were they carrying too much? Detachment here is not the absence of love. It is what happens when love has been asked to operate beyond human limits.
I think this is where the word detachment becomes especially confusing, because people often use it to describe very different emotional states. Some people detach in a healthy way, while others detach because they're emotionally shutting down, and from the outside, those two can look very similar. Both involve distance, both involve less emotional reaction, but internally, they come from completely different places. Healthy detachment is intentional and conscious. Emotional avoidance, on the other hand, is usually unconscious and driven by fear or exhaustion.
That distinction matters a lot. Healthy detachment doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop letting every situation control your emotional stability. You still feel, you still empathize, but you're not consumed. You're able to observe your emotions instead of drowning in them. Emotional avoidance is different because it disconnects you not only from others, but also from yourself. Instead of choosing distance, the person feels emotionally unavailable, numb, or disengaged without fully understanding why.
Exactly. Healthy detachment actually requires emotional awareness. You recognize what you feel, you name it, and then you decide how much access it should have to your energy. Avoidance skips that step entirely. Instead of saying, "This hurts, and I need space," the person simply shuts down. They stop responding, they stop explaining, they stop reflecting. Over time, this creates confusion both for the person detaching and for the people around them.
And what's interesting is that many people believe avoidance protects them from pain, but in reality, it just delays it. When emotions are avoided rather than processed, they don't disappear. They settle quietly in the background and resurface later as anxiety, resentment, irritability, or emotional numbness. Healthy detachment reduces emotional chaos. Avoidance stores it. One creates clarity, the other creates emotional backlog.
There's also an important connection between detachment and boundaries here. Healthy detachment usually grows alongside clear boundaries. You know what you're responsible for emotionally and what you're not. You understand where your role ends. Avoidance, however, often exists where boundaries were never learned. Instead of saying no, instead of communicating limits, the person disappears emotionally. Detachment becomes a substitute for communication rather than a result of it. That's why people who practice healthy detachment can still have deep relationships. They don't fear closeness. They simply don't confuse closeness with self-sacrifice. Emotional avoidance, by contrast, slowly erodes intimacy. The more someone avoids emotional engagement, the harder it becomes to reconnect later. Trust weakens, not because of conflict, but because of absence. I think what stays with me after talking about detachment is the realization that it's not something to judge yourself for. Detachment doesn't automatically mean you're cold, broken, or incapable of love. Very often, it's a response to too much feeling, too much giving, or too much silence where understanding should have been. When we look at detachment with honesty instead of shame, it becomes less about labeling ourselves and more about listening to what our emotional system is trying to tell us.
Yes, and maybe the most important thing to remember is that detachment is information. It tells you where something feels unsafe, unbalanced, or unsustainable. Whether it's healthy distance or emotional shutdown, it's a signal, not a verdict. Once you understand why you're detaching, you gain the ability to choose what comes next. You can rebuild connection. You can strengthen boundaries, or you can rest without guilt.
Detachment, when understood deeply, isn't the opposite of love. It's often the result of loving without protection for too long. And sometimes, learning how to detach in a healthy way is actually the first step toward reconnecting with others and with yourself in a way that's honest, stable, and sustainable.
And maybe that's the real takeaway. Detachment doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop abandoning yourself to keep something else alive. When care includes self-respect, it becomes stronger, not weaker.
Thank you for staying with us in this conversation. If this word felt personal, that's okay. Some words are meant to be felt, not just understood.
We'll see you in the next episode.